Companies operating in today's global economy really need to get an understanding of the international geopolitical risk landscape. At Infortal Worldwide, we work with our clients on solving risk before it starts. Welcome to the Riskology podcast, where we're looking at managing business risk globally and really understanding the geopolitical risk landscape.
Welcome back, everyone, to episode 26 of Riskology by Infortal, where we examine the world of geopolitics, finance, economics, and most importantly, the world of global risk. We've got a really exciting topic to hit today that's definitely splashing all over the headlines and is probably top of mind for a lot of our listeners out there. And that's the concept of polling and elections. What could possibly go wrong?
Everything can go wrong. It often does.
Yeah, and it's nothing new. You know, we've seen the recent elections, which definitely has everybody rattled in terms of expectations, but this is nothing new. People have heavily relied on polls only to be completely shocked once the election actually takes place. And to start, I thought we could go all the way back to the situation in 1948, Ian.
Yeah, so in 1948, you had Dewey projected to win, and you have very famous pictures of Harry Truman holding up the newspaper of Dewey winning the 1948 presidential election. And, well, if anybody can remember the Dewey administration, I challenge you to do that because, simply put, the Dewey administration did not exist. The polls were wrong. Truman won. But this kind of gets to, there's a whole bunch of problems in polling, and everybody watches polls. They look at polling headlines, but nobody really talks about why polling fails and how easy it is to do them badly. Sometimes they are slanted or doctored, and why they miss sort of these electoral landslides and upsets that people don't really necessarily catch.
Yeah, and before we unpack it all, we shouldn't underestimate the impact because think about it, even just in the office, conversations are already sparking based on the recent poll results that came out just the other week. And so these definitely have an impact on people's daily lives. And ultimately, it has an impact on markets. It has an impact on the S&P 500. It really has an overall impact on not only the U.S., but international economic affairs.
And why is that? Well, we look at polls as sort of a warning indicator or a leading indicator of upcoming policy. Polls, in theory, and usually, hopefully, will tell you what is coming in electoral outcome, and that will give you sort of a snapshot and preview and warning of upcoming policy. So if you're in business, your industry is looking at an upcoming election, an incoming administration or prime minister could massively affect your industry with regulation, taxation rates, new trade deals, etc. And polls give you some ample warning, in theory, of what may be coming and how you might sort of address that. So what are polls really? All they are surveys of responses to questions. That's really all it is. And this kind of starts to get into sort of the nitty-gritty of why polling doesn't often work. So like we talk about sample sizes and confidence intervals. So you see margins of error, usually like 3% to 1% or 5% sample sizes of likely voters or voters overall, or sometimes even just within a party. And those confidence intervals, those margins of error, are supposed to ideally control for noise. And we talk about sample sizes. People who don't often know much about polling, they'll say, well, that's just 300 people, or that's just 1,000 people. So to actually start to get an ample sample size, you need to have about 800 minimum to start to really get a good sort of snapshot of a universe. Because all polling is a sample of a population, a universe of cases, in this case, registered voters or likely voters, etc. So when you do a survey of this, you're getting a sample of their responses to key questions. And for that to sort of get the right weight, you need to have about 800, and it has to be distributed or more. You could have up to like 5,000 people, but usually it's between 8 and 1,200. And what you start to get is a sample of sentiment across that population, in theory. So you would weight the population based on party affiliation, location, age, gender, racial backgrounds, etc. And that will start to give you a sort of sense of where the population is in general on a specific candidate or race.
Yeah, and what's interesting is if you really think about, the genre of polling or the discipline of polling, it's really changed drastically in the past few years. And think about the population size. We talked about 1948 versus today. It's night and day to begin with in terms of sample size, but also technology has drastically changed over the past 50 years, over the past 20 years, and even the past 5 years. And so a lot of the polling methodologies are really out of date. And so there's a little bit of a scramble as well at the moment to actually figure out what is a robust quality way to measure polling. And there's a great study by the Pew Research Institute where they kind of break down, based on what we saw in 2016 with the Clinton-Trump election, and then in 2020, because the polling was so drastically wrong, it really brought everyone back to the drawing board. And there was a lot of credibility problems for, we all think of the CNN anchors and the maps that become sort of commonplace as we approach election season. But there was a huge credibility hit on a lot of the data and the info that was out there, both pre-2016, 2020, and most recently with some of the Senate elections. It's really showing that the polling methodologies are not keeping up with where society's at in terms of population growth, and particularly with technology growth. I mean, it used to be a case of hitting the phones. Who answers their cell phone anymore? How can you realistically get your sample size right? I think it's tough.
Yeah, historically, landline telephones were the main means of communication to actually access the population, the universe of voters that you're talking to. And historically speaking, in the U.S. case we're talking about here, this oversampled white women in their 40s historically as a major demographic, because that's typically who was home, usually more often than not, and that's who would answer the landlines. And that obviously, that's a very specific segment of the population. And then when you extrapolate from that, that builds in a lot of uncertainty into your polling. And this is where you start to get into like means of communication and demographic factors and definitions and questions. So on the sampling side, if you look at polling, one of the things that can go wrong is you can actually word questions very badly. We talk about bias in polling. Bias is most often a mistake rather than from a point of malevolence. It's really just based on the people you can get a hold of within a given area or through a different means of communication. So if you do a total online poll based on X or Twitter, for example, you're going to get a predominantly more urban, younger population rather than the population as a whole. If you do landline telephones, you're going to get a significantly older population. Probably a lot of them would be homeowners, et cetera. You're going to build in error by doing that. And sometimes you can also wind up doing polling on purpose, purposefully bad. I remember in grad school overhearing a conversation where someone was doing their own polling and they kept redefining the definition of Hispanic voters to get the results that they wanted. And overhearing that was just irksome beyond belief because it's a massive violation of ethics. But those are things that can happen. When you look at polling, another source of sort of noise or surprise is a lot of polling data and the way that sort of the studies on this have emerged over time. There's a lot of built-in essentialism in polling and voters. And what I mean by that is there's sort of assumptions made about demographics that they will always vote a certain way. But that's not entirely true. People think actively. They look at circumstances. Their preferences change based on the economy, based on their own sort of personal circumstances, et cetera, education. Demographics can only get you so far because at the end of the day, people are thinking individuals, and that can affect polling as well. Mm-hmm. So when you extrapolate that demographic X is going to vote for Y, that's not necessarily true. People can change their mind. You have electoral upsets. You also have realignments that occur periodically. I would say we're going through that right now in the U.S. Certainly you're seeing that in other parts of the world. Like right now, we're sitting in the middle of South Africa's election. They're counting results, and the ANC, the African National Congress, which has been in party since 1994 with the end of apartheid, they're going to lose a majority for the first time. And their old constituencies just aren't connecting with them the way that they used to because you have a realignment taking place. So those are all things that can cause upsets. Let me ask you this, Chris. Do people ever lie on polls?
They do indeed. And, that's a big problem is understanding the quality of the data that's sitting in front of you. And you hit on one of the big problems earlier, and that's the biases with the pollsters themselves. So you really need to understand, where are you getting your information from? Who's running these polls? Are there any other ulterior motives potentially? Or could there be some blatant biases based on the information source of the polling information that you're getting? So really important to kind of take a look where you're getting your polling information, but also make sure that you're not just relying on one source. You need to kind of vary your outlook and really pull in information from different sources. And taking a step back, and I'd like to hit on, how this impacts markets and companies, you've really got to make sure that you don't allow your operations, your investment strategies to get completely derailed by polling. I think you do have to be conscious of the polling. You do have to be enlightened to the fact that polling can sway the markets in certain ways, especially with certain industries. And so you do have to take that into account in terms of impact. But what you can't do is basically completely let the polls lead the way, because if you do that, then you're sure to end up in a surprising situation that you weren't expecting. And again, what you need to do is really talk through with your company, with your team, how you're planning to approach the election cycle. Depending on who wins, what that game plan is going to look like. There could be some significant policy changes depending on the outcome of elections. And, we're sort of alluding to national elections, but this also applies locally, statewide. Once you go international, it can get even crazier. So you do have to have contingency plans in place. But what you don't want to do is allow the polling to basically decide how that contingency plan looks, because it could be a very different outcome. And if you've only contingency planned your way through one, you may get stuck. So I don't know if you have thoughts there, Ian, in terms of how companies can really approach, not just the genre of polling, but even preparing for election outcomes.
So on election outcomes and polling, I would say start with polling and look at what is actually being polled. What is the sentiment of an upcoming election? And to do that, you kind of have to break down, is this looking at an individual? Is this looking at a political party? Or is this looking at policy? Because they're not the same thing. People typically are much more united on policy, for example, in terms of voter sentiment, than they are on party or individual. If you're polling individuals, all sorts of weird things can get in the way. There's a lot of research that shows that looks and how attractive somebody is can actually affect their polling popularity by up to 20% or more. You've seen this over the course of years. They've done multiple studies on this. So that can affect it. Now in the U.S., there's a lot of talk about Biden's age. Is his age really the factor? Is it really a Biden election? Or is this Democrats and Republicans? Or is this a policy election? And I think polls don't often do well at delineating one from the other. So if you're in business and you're looking at that, you need to look at not only the electoral results themselves, but what is actually being looked at. Is this a policy election? Is it a personal election, or is it a party election? Because that will affect your responses. So if it's a policy election and there's a policy change that's going to be demanded, that's going to significantly affect your industry, that's something that you need to look at much more carefully than just a personal election, because you can lobby individuals, you can lobby political parties, you can potentially even sue. But if you're dealing with a massive upsurge of sentiment regarding your industry or a certain sector of the economy, that's much harder to grapple with.
Yeah, the context is so important. And, something that's important, again, going back to contingency planning, is making sure that you're not just looking at the results, but you're also considering overall sentiment. As you mentioned, for certain industries, that will be key. And then once you go into the international sphere, it's going to be even more important to really understand how the local politics work, how the overall political framework is set up, so that you know how your company can move forward. And so, think about it. You may see the headlines related to a lot of the international elections now and think, I've got no skin in the game, right? There's no impact. I'm completely here. I'm domestic. I don't even care who gets elected, south of the border, you may be thinking. But the truth is, those elections can have a knock-on effect based on impacts to supply chain, impacts to international relations. All of a sudden, tariffs may be completely derailing your operational or your revenue sort of expectations for the next quarter or even next few years. So gaining an understanding of what your risk exposure looks like is really important. And again, it can't really be done through polling. You really need to understand the context in terms of not only how those elections and political situations look, feel, and work, but also, what your contingency plan will be given the result. And, you may have to look at some drastic changes. China's obviously not having an election, but if you think about the impact of international relations between China and other countries based on other elections that are happening around the world, that's really significant. And we're seeing a lot of fallout from some recent elections. Argentina's one, where Argentina was sort of lost at sea and leaning towards China to a certain degree. And that's completely flipped. And now, the new president of Argentina, Milei, has even had meetings with business leaders here in the US, the governor of Texas. And so had you not had a pulse on that, you could have lost out on an opportunity there.
It can affect your entire market too in ways that you may not even be directly affected by, but in a way that can affect you in a macro sense. So if you look at Europe right now, you're looking at sort of this right-wing coalition that's forming at the European Parliament level, where you have national level parties on the right that are collaborating. And what does that look like for the EU? What does that look like for trade, environmental policy, defense spending, social spending, monetary policy, et cetera? All these things sort of trickle up. So if you do business or have investors in Europe, or maybe you're in Europe itself, even if you don't think that this election in Italy affects you or this election in France, it will, because it trickles up. For example, if you're looking at getting out of China, you're looking at trying to potentially stay in Southeast Asia or get a better manufacturing deal. You're looking very closely at the performance of the BJP in India, which is the current ruling party, because they want manufacturers to go to India and get out of China, and they're trying to take that business from China. And that's predominantly a BJP platform item. If it was the National Congress, the Congress Party, it would be a very different deal. So elections have consequences for your business.
Right. And, again, going back to the international landscape, look at the situation in the United Kingdom. No one saw this election coming this quickly. And, Labour is 20 points ahead, supposedly, as of last week. If they were to call that election today, I don't think there's anyone that really knows where the true spread lands at the moment, not even the bookies. You can gamble on elections in the UK. I think if you were just relying purely on the polls, then this would be a done deal. This election would be over.
Yeah, the UK is a weird case right now because some countries can have snap elections. In the US, you can't. Once you, roll the dice, you're stuck for 4 years or 2 years, depending on who you're voting for, or 6 years if you're talking about the Senate. But in the UK, they can have snap elections, and Labour's projected to win. But it's very odd that the opposition to Labour, being the Tories or the Conservative Party, why they would call an election that they're so likely to lose. There has to be some sort of logic to that. It's not just coincidental. So if you look more closely at the UK scenario, you have Labour, which is saying that it is rebranded. It's rebranded from sort of the far left, Jeremy Corbyn, Corbynista type of Labour Party of just 10 years ago. And is that really true? There's a lot of questions about what Labour wants to do in its policy portfolio. Like, what's its actual platform? What does it want to do in terms of policy? And so far, there haven't been a lot of details on that. The only thing I can think of is that the Tories are trying to sort of use this uncertainty as a way to beat Labour ahead of time. And whether that turns out to be true, whether or not Labour sort of goes back to sort of a Tony Blair style of Labour government where it's more pro-business as opposed to far left, I think that's a question that remains to be seen. Certainly, they've tried to rebrand. Whether or not they've rebranded in time to have an electoral success, or maybe people are just so upset at the status quo, that could be driving their decision to have the snap election. And just to kind of step back, if you look at the global scenario, something that everyone needs to sort of look at is that there's populism sort of rising up, in different parts of the world. But even more than that, there's a massive animosity towards incumbents right now. If you think about it, people have had 4 to 5 years of pandemic, uncertainty, high inflation, and war, and people are royally upset about this. And it's manifesting differently in different countries. So in some cases, that's translating into populism. on the right. In some cases, that's translating into populism on the left. And even authoritarian governments, if you look at Xi Jinping, he's not super popular right now. There's a reason he's sort of rattling the saber around Taiwan. If you look at discontent in China over the economy, it's palpable. Even authoritarians can't escape sentiment entirely. So if you look at the sort of electoral cycle and just where everyone stands, people are upset at the people that govern them. People feel like they're not being listened to. They're not getting what they pay for in terms of taxes. And that's showing. That's showing in the polls. That's showing in electoral outcomes.
Yeah. And when there's that much emotion involved in a lot of the civil unrest that we're seeing both here in the US and around the world is illustrative of that. That can have a major impact on polling and what you see today versus what you might see come election time. Because it's so volatile, because things are changing so quickly and there's so much emotion involved, a lot can change over the course of a 6-month period. It can be drastically different in terms of outlook, in terms of sentiment, and ultimately, approach to market conditions. Going back to Argentina, I mean, look how quickly things have changed. Very drastic in terms of the measures that we're taking and experimental to a certain degree, but just think about how fast things have changed in terms of the value of the currency and stabilizing things there. So I think that's important to factor in. And again, don't approach the polls as though it's a transaction and it's data that you can easily use to translate into strategic decision making. You've got to basically put it into context, understand the bias. Again, as Ian mentioned, things are changing rapidly. So you really have to think about what your contingency game plan is, depending on which way the election goes, not depending on how you're viewing it or how the polls are viewing it today. Really important. So yeah, we covered a lot in terms of elections, in terms of polling today. As we promised earlier in the series, we do plan to keep checking in on the election cycle. I know everyone is already sick of the election propaganda that's traveling around, but it's something that's important to all businesses. And international elections have a much greater impact today than they used to. And so I think it's important that as we continue on through the series, we'll continue to check in on these international elections. With that being said, this closes out episode 26 of Riskology by Infortal.